Are we ready? Can you see me? Am I on the camera? Yeah. I will be. Okay. So I don't want to stand in front of Andrew. It's really awkward. So welcome back to our final session this morning. I hope you've had a really good morning so far with papers and short papers. It went really quickly, the 10 minutes. So I feel a bit bamboozled. We had some excellent papers in my room. And we're on to the final, really exciting section this morning, the Peacocke Prize. There's no prizes for guessing why we named it the Peacocke Prize. Of course, it's named after our founder, our president, Reverend Dr. Andrew Peacocke. Wow, that's bad, isn't it? My mind went blank. That's fine. So Arthur Peacocke, of course. And it's a prize. There's a cash prize. You get membership at the SRF for a year. You get to come to the conference and possibility of publication. And it's wonderful to award it after a number of years, mostly due to the pandemic and the lockdown. So it's really exciting to be able to stand here and award it to a person in person. So that's really, really exciting. We had a lot of entries this year, and they were all at a really, really high standard. So it was a difficult job to choose. But the committee have decided to award it to Andrew Jackson for a number of reasons, not mostly his depth of knowledge and the implications of the work as well. It was really hard to choose, but his contribution, his essay really shone. So let me tell you a little bit about Andrew. My email's gone down, sorry. So Andrew Jackson gained an MA in zoology from Oxford University and then a PhD in biomaterial science from Reading University, after which he pursued a 30-year career in medical technology research and development. Then he worked for 2 years at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion, working as their external affairs director. Deciding to retire early, Andrew then went on to fulfill a lifelong interest in theology, taking the advanced diploma and MPhil in theology from Cambridge University, gaining distinction there and being awarded the Theological Studies Prize in each. He is currently in the second year of his PhD project at Nottingham University, working with Michael Burdett and Conor Cunningham, looking at how Maximus, the Confessor, Logoi, cosmology can shed new light on evolutionary biology. He's going to talk about that now, but we're going to award him the prize. I've never done this before, but I'm a bit nervous. So shall we shake hands? There we are.
Yeah, that's good.
So we have, there we are.
We're being photographed, yes. Do I shake hands? Thank you, Julian. It really is a great honour to be awarded the prize. Also, a great encouragement. As some of you may know who've done a PhD, you know, when you're in your second year and you're in your doldrums period of your PhD, you know, you need a bit of encouragement. So I count it as a vote of confidence from an audience and a readership in science-engaged theology or theology-engaged scientists like you are, who are my ideal readership. So I'm really encouraged by that. So what I want to do is read out my essay, which will take about 25 minutes, so please bear with me. But at the end, I will put some summary slides up that will hopefully remind you of what I've said. A couple of sort of caveats to start with. I'm using the word Eastern, and it's already been pointed out to me. I need to be careful because just like the Western, there's a lot of differences of opinion. So I'm using the word Eastern as a first approximation to a body of opinion, but there will be lots of people who want to disavow themselves. You know, the Eastern Church consists of Greek, Russian, Coptic, etc. The second thing is that if there are any patristics experts amongst you who want to see the textual evidence, most of it I'm not going to be reading out because it was in footnotes. So you'll have to see me later if you want to see the primary textual evidence of what I say, okay? So the last few decades have seen a renaissance of interest in the works of Maximus the Confessor, the 6th, 7th century Byzantine theologian and monk, across both Eastern and Western Christian traditions. But despite his current popularity, there have been relatively few sustained attempts at bringing to bear his theological and metaphysical thought with modern-day science, let alone evolutionary biology. This is a pity because Maximus, and indeed the Eastern Orthodox tradition more broadly, offers a rich resource from which to draw fresh perspectives on evolution, perspectives that are not always acknowledged in standard treatments of evolution and theology. My task in this essay is to raise awareness of the potential for the Eastern tradition to shed new light on evolution, in the hope that others will also be inspired to contribute to a long overdue research program on what might be called an Eastern theology of evolution. I will attempt to do this in two ways. First, I will exemplify in some detail what the Eastern tradition has to offer by way of Maximus the Confessor's Logoi cosmology and its curious resemblance to evolutionary descent. I will then, in much less detail, gesture towards some other resources from the Eastern tradition that could, with further research, allow a more comprehensive model to be built of God's action in evolution that promises to be significantly different from most of the familiar Western approaches. A tentative conclusion will be that, based on Maximus's Logoi vision, our default view of evolution should be that it is intrinsically good, since it is immanently the Logos. Those aspects of evolution that appear not to be good can be attributed to the so-called garments of skin conceded by God as part of a simultaneous creation and fall. Although not without its problems, I hope that a Maximian and Eastern view of evolution will take its place among the diverse theological perspectives of evolution currently on offer, and that it will receive much more scholarly attention than it has to date. In recent years, there have been several references made to an apparent similarity between Maximus the Confessor's concept of the Logoi and the modern-day theory of Darwinian evolution. Examples include I quote, the Logoi being ontological codes or spiritual DNA, organisms and species being points on evolutionary fitness landscapes imagined in the mind of God, possessing Logoi, and evolution moving forward through various Logoi. In each of these cases, the authors suggest that the Logoi are somehow involved in both the ontological definition of creatures and their evolutionary development, though the authors give no detailed explanation of how the Logoi relate to our modern-day understanding of creaturely form and evolutionary change. Whatever are the reasons for such apparent reticence, much more, I believe, remains to be said. To begin with, we need to understand what Maximus meant by the Logoi. By the time of Maximus, the Greek word logos, plural logoi, despite being quite polysemous in everyday language, had some strong philosophical connotations in relation to theological and philosophical cosmology. Plato's demiurge created according to a logos paradigm. The Stoics believed in a universe upheld by rational principles, logoi. St. John the Evangelist used the word logos to describe the second person of the Trinity. And St. Augustine equated the Logoi with God's ideas. Against this background, Maximus was to develop the notion of the Logoi even further, seeing them as, on the one hand, divine ideas or predeterminations, and on the other hand, as divine wills or utterances, the former stressing the divine exemplarity upon which creation is modelled, and the latter emphasizing the divine freedom and resulting contingency of all created being. With both these senses in mind, the Logoi account for the amazing diversity and plurality of creation, from the most generic entities right down to the most particular, all of which are simultaneously good, since their form is derived from God, and contingent, since their existence is derived from nothing. By breaking the logos down into multiple logoi and by assigning logoi to particulars as well as universals, Maximus is highlighting that everything in creation is premeditatively coded and mapped. Philosophically, we could understand this in terms of Aristotelian formal causes that specify the intelligible content of creatures. The logos as exemplar or archetype being the extrinsic formal cause, and the logoi being intrinsic formal causes that cohere across both logos and creatures. Scientifically, we could think of the logoi as the information content of creatures that makes them intelligible beings, whether that be their genome sequences or any number of ways of quantifying their phenotypes. But the resemblance between the logoi and biological organisms goes much further than just rational specification. First, in Ambiguum 10, Maximus contemplates a contraction and expansion of all things from the most generic genera to the most particular individuals, very much reminiscent of the biological taxonomies that cluster organisms into nested hierarchies. Like all classificatory schemes, this could be merely an abstract imposition of humanly imagined distinctions, such as classifying organisms according to their colour or size. But in Maximus's case, there is reason to believe that his classification is according to substance, cutting nature at her joints, reflecting immanent ontological similarities and differences rather than superficial resemblances. Of course, what Maximus could not have known was that the ontological classification resulting from his contemplation was actually a result of an historical descent with modification. The generic logoi that Maximus understood to be really present in the individuals that host them, we now know correspond to those homologous genetic and phenotypic features of organisms that are derived from shared ancestry. Second, in Ambiguum 7, Maximus states that, I quote, all created things are positively defined by their own logoi and by the logoi that exist around them and which constitute their defining limits. The logoi are not radiating out from the logos in an independent fashion, but are interacting along the way, producing new logoi in the process. From a synchronic perspective, Maximus may have been aware of this from the complex ecological relations that exist between creatures in the natural world. But it also makes sense from our diachronic evolutionary perspective, whereby organisms co-evolve rather than evolve in isolation from one another. These are intriguing correlations, but to do justice to Maximus, we must attend to other aspects of his logoi vision, which may at first glance seem less compatible with our modern understanding of evolution. For example, the logoi specify not only creaturely form, but also their final ends, unlike blind algorithmic evolution. The logoi are unchanging and inviolable, unlike ever-mutable species. And above all, the logoi are themselves the good, the very logos of God, unlike nature red in tooth and claw. Furthermore, this evolutionary interpretation of the logoi raises some acute theological concerns. If the logoi are immanently co-inherent across the logos and creatures, and if, as Maximus says, there are logoi for the most general to the most particular things, then it would seem that not only is creation part of God, but that everything is also fully determined by God, the effects of which might be to erode the creator-creature distinction, to impugn God's simplicity, and to exacerbate the theological problems arising from the randomness and cruelty of evolution. Each of these apparent disanalogies between the logoi and evolution, and each of the ensuing theological concerns, is worthy of a much lengthier treatment than I have space to give here. My intention is not to offer detailed responses, but to illustrate some of the theological resources that the Eastern tradition can call upon to address these perceived problems. The following is an example of the approaches that might be taken. Excuse me a second. First of all, stability and change. Maximus is quite clear that the Logoi are immutable and inviolable, and so it is tempting to think that he understood them to be Platonic forms or universals existing as timeless and unchangeable types in the intelligible divine realm in which the sensible created realm can then participate, albeit weakly and imperfectly. It is this kind of typological thinking that was to be seriously challenged by the population thinking of Darwinism, with its blurring of ontological boundaries through time and space. But Maximus was no Platonist. For him, every detail of creation is pre-codified in the Logos and executed without error or diminution. The Logoi appear at their proper time in the finite realm, all the while existing eternally and unchangeably in the Logos. Therefore, the inviolability of the Logoi needs to be understood not in terms of lack of phenomenological change in creation, but in terms of absence of any change within God's intentions, thus ruling out those varieties of process and kenotic theology that see evolution as a dynamic interplay between God's ultimate purposes and creation's autonomous freedom. For Maximus, creaturely ontology follows God's will ineluctably every step of the way. Only in the case of human beings is there to be found a freedom that allows their so-called tropos, a malleable mode of human expression, to either follow or depart from their ontological logos of being, the logos tes ousias. Secondly, teleology and immanence. The teleological nature of the Logoi is a result of the fact that creation is in motion towards its final repose in God, the summing up of all things in the Logos. The fact that, as Maximus insists, the Logos is the Logoi and vice versa, means that this purpose is not externally imposed by God, but internally lived out by God. The Logos does not threaten the causal closure assumed by metaphysical naturalism, since he does not add anything new that was not already present from the beginning. This has been known as panentheistic or incarnational naturalism, in which God does not compete with his own creation, but is immanently unfolding within it as his eternal fixed instructions. Such an immanentist view of God's operating within evolution is not new, and was an early theological response to Darwinism, exposing as it did the implicit deism lurking in those externalist notions of God as a divine watchmaker or demiurge. Taken to its logical conclusion, the fact that God acts in, with, and under the processes of biological evolution implies that A, nothing is left to chance in the creation of new ontology, and B, that every creature is theophanic, revealing both God's unfolding purposes and God himself. Therefore, contrary to those models of divine action in which God kenotically gives chance a role to play in the achievement of his ends, and contrary to those that see only tragedy and failure in the countless deaths and extinctions of intermediate individuals and species, the Maximian vision would tend to emphasize the purposefulness and goodness of all products of evolution. Every transitional form, no matter how ephemeral, has the dignity of being specified by the Logos and has the sacredness of actually being somehow the Logos incarnate. Number 3, the created-uncreated distinction. How then can the creator-creature distinction be safeguarded against a whole-scale pantheism or divine idealism? The answer can be found in two distinctively Eastern resources: the concept of the divine energies and the metaphysical distinction between logos and tropos or mode. Maximus speaks of certain things existing eternally around God, peritheu, yet not being identical to God's essence. These divine energies or activities are in some sense in God without affecting the fundamental simplicity of God and without adding extra persons to the Trinity. Hence, from the divine perspective, the Logoi are eternal designs and utterances of God, yet fall short of being God's very essence. From the created perspective, these same designs and utterances are concretely and perfectly realized in creatures, but in a mode of existence that is utterly incommensurate with that of God, a God who is in any case beyond existence. The Logoi bridge God and creation in such a way that creation can be said to be both ex deo, by virtue of the eternal divine specification, and ex nihilo, by virtue of the eternal divine will and power to instantiate in a mode outside the Godhead. Such a view is significantly different from those Western traditions that would prefer to speak in terms of finite creatures participating in a transcendent deity rather than sharing anything in common. Of course, this raises the question of what is actually meant by tropos or mode, and whether such a metaphysical term can be interpreted scientifically. Could it be that mode is a placeholder term for the vehicle or platform that carries or contains information, akin to how the same data can be stored in different media? What, in any case, is information, and are we in danger of reifying it? These are the kinds of questions that an Eastern science-engaged theology would be well placed to answer. Fourthly, evolutionary evil. The most difficult challenge for any theology of evolution is the debris left in the wake of evolutionary change, the competition, violence, suffering and destruction that is part of the differential survival and reproduction upon which the process of natural selection depends. The suffering of non-human creatures is a particularly troublesome aspect, since its occurrence for millions of years before the arrival of Homo sapiens makes it less easily attributable to a cosmic fall resulting from Adam and Eve's first sin. Many theodicies and defenses have been advanced to account for why God used an evolutionary process involving so much suffering, and I cannot review them here. Suffice it to say that Maximus's Logoi doctrine and the Eastern tradition more broadly offer some perspectives that have not, in my view, been fully explored in the science-engaged theology literature. Much work needs to be done, but what follows are some initial suggestions. Firstly, since the Logoi are teleological as well as constitutive, any attempt to contemplate the Logoi, and hence the Logos, in the natural world needs to take account of the final destiny of creatures as well as their current form. The creation we see around us is not yet as it should be, but is in motion towards its final summing up in Christ, which Maximus describes in one of his famous triads as a transition from being to well-being to eternal well-being. This is not a returning to an initial paradisical state from which creation has fallen, but a gradual development from an earlier immature state to a final consummation. According to this Eastern model, the historical incarnation was always part of God's plan, irrespective of sin, though the effect of sin was to add the need for the cross. Creation proper should therefore be seen as its end rather than its beginning or middle, since, as Maximus says, I quote, "The Logos of God, who is God, wills always and in all things to accomplish the mystery of his embodiment." A cosmic incarnation in which the Logoi of all creatures reach their end point in the archetype from which they were originally derived. Secondly, the disvalues of creation can be linked to its immaturity, not in a causal way as when death follows a consequence of sin, but in a structural way as when death and suffering are integral to soul-making. Such a structural relationship is consistent with Maximus's view of a simultaneous and coextensive creation and fall, in which God put in place certain limitations and hardships from the beginning in anticipation of humankind's sin. Panayotis Nellas has developed the Eastern patristic idea of garments of skin from Genesis 3 verse 21 as God's punitive concessions, which include sex, conception, birth, pollution, lactation, food, excretion, growth, old age, sickness, and death. In other words, biological life as we know it. To the Western mind, this might sound absurdly Gnostic or Manichaean, but whether or not he is right to ascribe so much of what constitutes material life to garments of skin, the point is well made that some such distinction between original good intentions and remedial concessions might account for the ambiguity of much that we see in creation. Since the garments of skin are present from the beginning of the world and not just after humans appear, they create no conflict with an evolutionary chronology. Thirdly, the distinction between the Logoi en route to their final telos in Christ and the garments of skin that were not originally intended raises the question as to the ontological status of these garments. Are they defined by Logoi, by the absence of Logoi, i.e. privation, or by something else, for example, a special tropos or mode of existence? Further research is needed in this area, but a clue as to where the answer might be found lies in Maximus's distinction between the different wills of God, his good will, his economic will, and his concessive will. In the context of creation, these could be interpreted to mean the good will to accomplish eventual deification of the cosmos, that is, creation as it should be, the economic will to employ an evolutionary process of maturation, and the concessive will to allow non-good elements to intrude upon that process for the purpose of remedial punishment. Note that this three-way division is in contrast to the two-way division often assumed in discussions of evolutionary theodicy, where reasons are sought for why God chose to create either by evolution or by instantaneous fiat. The Eastern three-way distinction allows us to see that the disjunction between evolution and no evolution might be too simplistic. Could it be that there are some aspects of evolution that correspond to the garments of skin and others that correspond merely to a process of maturation? I would like to suggest one possibility. It is often assumed that the essential components of Darwinian evolution are natural selection, competition, differential survival, and extinction. These components appear to be necessary, if unfortunate, consequences of organisms inhabiting a world of finite resources. If, however, the finitude of the Earth's resources is itself a garment of skin imposed by God as a concession, then perhaps in the absence of such concession, organisms could have evolved without experiencing any competition due to resource conflicts. Darwinian evolution could have consisted solely of the good aspects, variation and adaptation, without the bad aspects, competition and natural selection. A world of infinite environmental niches could theoretically accommodate all the variation produced by mutation and recombination. Although natural death might still occur, there would be no premature death due to competition or predation. Evolution would still take place, but in a much more extravagant fashion, with no culling of weaker lineages or domination of one lineage over another. Of course, one could say that it would also involve a loss, the absence of the cougar or the deer whose hunting or escaping prowess would never have had the chance to flourish. However, if the ability to cause harm and suffering will one day be eliminated, then there is no reason why the redeemed versions of the cougar or the deer could not have emerged via a different phylogenetic route in a world of infinite resources. My final suggestion for how a Maximian and Eastern perspective can offer new resources for understanding evolution concerns creation as it is now rather than how it might have been. Whatever may be its final redeemed state, we find ourselves in a world that is currently full of suffering, arrived at through a process of suffering. One response to this situation has been to appeal to God's co-suffering on the cross in the person of his Son Jesus Christ. God shares with creation's suffering, standing with it in solidarity, knowing what it feels like in some equivalent sense. However, creation is not God, and no matter how God might empathize, his own suffering does not remove the autonomous experience of creatures that suffer. That at least is what follows from a Western perspective. From an Eastern, more panentheistic perspective, the Logos not only suffers alongside or with creation, but also suffers as creation, qualified, of course, by the distinction between energies and essence. Creation can therefore be said to be cruciform in a much more profound sense through an immanent cosmic Christ than through a representative historic Christ. In conclusion, I have argued that the Eastern tradition can offer a radically fresh perspective on the theology of biological evolution. Buoyed by its emphasis on the constitutive immanence of the Logos, Eastern theology can afford to be less intimidated by the apparent aimlessness and cruelty of evolution. It can be confident in the intrinsic goodness of all that is, knowing that creation, when correctly contemplated, is nothing less than a cosmic incarnation. Part of that correct contemplation is to discern the full scope of the logoi that define creatures, their teleological as well as their instructional aspect, by which we can see creation in its true light, from its end rather than its beginning. Another part is to be able to distinguish those elements of evolution that are consistent with God's good will and design from others that might be secondary concessions resulting from God's foreknowledge of humankind's sin. And a still further part is to know that the Logos suffers not only in the first century as a particular male Jew, but suffers through all time as all living things. So thank you for listening.
Did you say you had slides as well? Or?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks for reminding me. So Maximus's Logoi, the ideas and wills, which leads to this dual concept of creation ex deo and ex nihilo, they're immanently and mutually constitutive. So this is why people talk about ontological codes, spiritual DNA. They define the most generic to the most particular, not just to species, to particulars, in a hierarchical fashion. And that occurs in two different directions: expansive, processing, happening in time, but also contractive and returning, which ultimately happens outside time because it's an act of grace, deification. They are also inviolable according to Maximus, and very famously and provocatively he says the Logoi are the Logos, and the Logoi, and that Logos is the Logoi. The Logos is the Logoi. So my interpretation of this, first of all, the first stage in the argument is that Maximus uses a famous analogy from Dionysius of a kind of a wheel with spokes on, the Logos in the center and the Logoi radiating out, all constrained by providence. So the outward expansion, where the one Logos becomes the many Logoi, is procession and divergence, and then the reverse is return and convergence. But he also says that it happens in a hierarchical fashion, and the Logoi are interdependent and define each other from the most generic to the most particular. So on the left-hand side you can see the outward expansion, which corresponds in his triad of the Logos of being, which happens in time, in real human history, finite history. But the return part of it, where the particulars go back to being part of the Logos, happens, well, for humans it happens as part of ascesis, as sanctification, aligning our modes of being with our Logos. But for non-human creation, it must happen outside time, because they have no choice. They have no malleable tropos, as far as I can read in Maximus. So overall, that's very reminiscent of a phylogenetic classification, where the way you classify reflects history, embedded identity rather than just a nominal classification. So I put there a famous circular representation of the tree of life, which you can interrogate online and drill down into specific lineages. But as I've said, there are a number of possible problematic implications which I have attempted to address with further Eastern resources. So if the Logos constitutes creation, are we not getting into dangerous waters of pantheism? Well, yes, maybe if it was Aquinas' divine ideas, that would be a problem. But for the Eastern tradition, they have this view of the divine energies which encircle God, which are his eternal attributes in which creation participates, and also finite mode of existence, which is a kind of, going back to Professor Gregerson's talk on different ways of hosting information on CDs and vinyl, record players and tapes. It's a bit like the information, God's intentions, are univocal across creation and God, but its instantiation is entirely different. The Greek phrase is tropos huparxios, a different mode of existence. Secondly, Maximus is very, very firm on saying the Logoi are inviolable, and at first sight that seems to be in conflict with the changeability of species, but I think that's really referring to the inviolability of God's will. Now, Maximus, undoubtedly a child of his age, would have been thinking of the inviolability of species as well, but if he'd known about evolution, I think he would have seen no conflict between what he was really getting at, that God's will is fixed. Thirdly, deterministic, which might be troublesome for some, but for Maximus, it doesn't apply to human beings. Human beings are a special case. They have true freedom. But I have searched long and hard for any evidence in Maximus to suggest that he thinks that there's a kind of freedom in non-human creation, and I can't find it. Fourthly, imminently teleological. Now, this sounds like pre-formationism, which used to be very heretical in evolutionary biology. It's what Darwin went away from. But actually, I don't think there's any inconsistency with that view with more modern understandings of evolution, where the full information content from environment and genes and phenotypes all contributes to the adaptation of organisms. And Father Christopher Knight, who's one of the famous players in theories of divine action, talks about this in terms of fixed instructions, which are fixed in the mind of God, but play out and unfold in history. Another thing is the goodness of the Logoi, but how can we reconcile that with the bad parts of evolution? Well, I've tried to explain how the garments of skin and simultaneous creation fall might be a way of tackling that, and that's very neglected. You won't come across that very often in the literature on evolutionary theodicy. And finally, theophanic, the God-revealing potential of creation. Well, that's true if contemplated correctly. Now, for the Greeks, you need to practice ascesis, you have to discipline the body, you have to develop the eye of God to be able to see the world properly. So it's okay to see a sunset and see God, but if you looked at an ichneumon wasp, would you see God? Well, if you're seeing it from the end, so if we really knew what an ichneumon wasp would look like in the final eschaton, that would be seeing properly, because we'd be seeing the Logoi, not just of being, well-being, but also eternal well-being. So I think that's it, just to acknowledge various people who've helped me so far in my project, many of which are Greek or Eastern scholars.
So questions for Andrew, just before we go into lunch.
Thank you, Andrew, for your beautiful presentation. I just have a question on how Maximus would conceive the notion of contingency, especially for non-human creatures. And I would like to make a quick example that came in my mind during your talk. So imagine you have a bottle where there is a medium where bacteria grows, and then you would add an antibiotic, then this bacteria eventually, maybe not, will mutate to resist, and you could say create a new species, resist. So, if I understood you correctly, in Maximus' view, this logoi would have pre-existed, both of the bacteria and the bacteria mutated. Then, what I will say is that is the effect of contingency, the experiment, the scientists that add the antibiotic. So would you say that even adding the antibiotic inside there is the logoi?
Right. So,
in other words, how does Maximum account for contingency?
Right.
Because if I didn't add the antibiotic, there wouldn't be the new form.
So I can answer that question in two ways. One is a sort of textual Maximus answer, and the other is my construction. So as far as I can find, Maximus nowhere talks about the freedom of non-human creation. The closest is Ambiguum 42, which is the go-to place where he talks about tropos. But there he says all of creation has a tropos, but he doesn't suggest that non-human creation has the ability to vary its tropos like humans. So we humans, we can choose to follow our logos or not. If we don't, we basically fall into non-existence eventually. There's another way he mentions in Ambiguum 42 where non-human creation can have different tropoi, but that is through apparent supernatural intervention in miracles. So he goes at great length explaining the parting of the Red Sea and various other miracles in which the thing itself hasn't changed its nature. Its logos has remained the same, but its tropos has changed. So the burning bush is still has a logoi of a bush, but God has changed its mode. But that's not the bush exercising any freedom, that's God's intervention. So that's the first part of my answer. The other part of my answer would be to say that in terms of contingency, from our perspective, everything's different from our perspective. On our creaturely plane, we can see what seems to be ontological indeterminacy at quantum level. We can see chaotic indeterminacy, epistemic limitations, but that has no bearing on God's predeterminations, as far as I can see in Maximian thought, right? So we can talk about, for scientific purposes, contingency, and that serves a purpose very well. But metaphysically, is it really free? And why do we worry about the contingency and freedom of non-human creatures? What is it to a rock or a tree to be free? It's a very anthropocentric concept based around the need for culpability and for feeling that we have control of ourselves.
Thanks very much indeed, Andrew. That's a really interesting essay and presentation generally. I just wanted to pick your brains on one thing. You mentioned Dionysius and his influence on Maximus, and clearly all the language about procession and return is deeply Dionysian and actually deeply Neoplatonic. It's Proclus, I think, with all this comes from. Now, one of the things about Dionysius' thought is that much of it's anchored in the liturgy and in liturgical considerations. Does Maximus pick up on that at all? And if so, how would that affect the kind of argument you're...
It does. That's a really good point. And that's something I haven't yet, and I'm not sure whether I should go into in my research, but yeah, a liturgical view of the universe is reflected in Maximus's commentary on the things like the procession in church of the priests and the congregation. It's all very symbolic, and the two match together. So liturgy and creation, the temple, symbolism, I haven't worked out yet how to sort of integrate it with evolutionary biology, but if you have any ideas. Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. That's an exciting and wonderful talk. My question is, with the energies and kind of moving towards theosis or deification, my question really has to do with how God is ever known, and if the logoi, in terms of categories, are somehow dissolved so that God's simplicity comes through, right? There's always this remove, I feel like, in Eastern theology, where there's the essence somehow standing behind the attributes. So will God ever be known? And in that case, what happens to the logos?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a very controversial question between West and East, and between Aquinas and the Eastern Church. So, although Maximus talks about the energies, he doesn't talk about them as much as Gregory of Palamas hundreds of years later, which was in response to the hesychast controversy. So this is a controversy where the monks on Mount Athos were claiming to see the divine light, by implication seeing God's essence. And Gregory of Palamas came to their defense to say, no, they're seeing the energies around God. Nobody can see the essence. Whereas I think Aquinas, I'm not an Aquinas expert, but I think for him it was important to be able to see the essence of God, not through our own ability, but by an act of grace on God's part.
Thank you very much. Are all logi realised, or are there many redundant logi that are never realised?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. Maximus doesn't talk about that, unlike Aquinas. So the sort of scholastic equivalent to Maximus's Logoi are the divine ideas of Aquinas. And Aquinas does talk about ideas that may not be realised. So all of Aquinas' ideas are God's ways in which he can see his nobilities and excellencies mimicked. And so he thinks that many of them will never be instantiated, but they're still potential ones. And then you have the problem, well, you've got potentiality in God, you know. So, but Maximus, as far as I've read, doesn't talk about that counterfactual. That's a good question, though.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Andrew. I did enjoy that. Can you just help me out on these garments of skin? Because I was thinking to myself, God has learned a lesson from Microsoft here. You create a universe, you see what goes wrong, and then you create a version 2.0. I'm sure that's not what he meant, but you know, that's what it sounded like to me. Can you help me out?
Yeah, well, it is a somewhat mystical thing, which is part of the Eastern tradition. Its value is in saying that God is not responding in our real time to mankind's sin with all the chronological problems that creates with modern science. Its value is in that it's part of God's plan to include some defensive concomitant responses to what will happen when free creatures are created. So it's like the insurance policy is there from the very beginning rather than a reactive repair. Now, it's still shrouded in mystery. Why would God, you know, there are still questions about theodicy that still apply to the Eastern tradition. Why would God do that? Can't he produce something that will never sin and still be free? And then there wouldn't need to be garments of skin. But Maximus and none of the Eastern tradition that I've read tackle that question.
It's lunchtime, and so we need to bring the questions to a close. I'm sure you agree with me and the rest of the committee that, Andrew, your essay was more than worthy of several Peacocke Prizes, and I'm sure the conversations will continue as well. So please join me in thanking Andrew once again, and we'll see you after lunch.